August 17th, 1943. 24,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley. The sky is a violent gray, sunlight fractured by smoke trails, bursts of flak, and the trembling silver shape of a B-17F named Red Molly fighting to stay level. The left wing groans under the stress of evasive turns. Paint flakes whip away into the slipstream like sparks from a grinder. Inside the cockpit, First Lieutenant Walter Bristow grips the yoke with white knuckles. A fresh jolt shudders through the aircraft, hard enough to rattle teeth. The interphone crackles. "Pilot, this is Crew Chief Martin, sir. We've got a problem at the root." Bristow leans out of his seat, squinting through the frozen glass toward where the wing meets the fuselage. Under the vibration and the stress of the turn, the metal skin is beginning to ripple, almost breathing. One more flak burst, one wrong maneuver, and the wing might not stay on. The B-17 is famous for toughness, but not invincible. You can almost feel the cold air biting through the fuselage, the hydraulic lines trembling, the tension of 10 men realizing their fate might depend on those few feet of metal. Bristow steadies his breathing. Hold her together. Just hold. But the wing root groans, louder this time, a sound no airman ever forgets, a sound that means the next second could be their last. And yet, unbelievably, it doesn't fail. It should have. By every measure, it should have. What none of the men aboard Red Molly know, not yet, is that the only thing keeping that wing from tearing free is a maintenance quirk introduced by a man whose name they've never heard. A factory janitor. A janitor who wasn't even supposed to be near the assembly floor. A janitor whose quiet suggestion, ignored at first, would go on to save crews just like Bristow's. Hundreds of them. But that part of the story begins far from the Ruhr Valley. On a rainy morning inside Boeing Plant 2, Seattle, Washington.
The factory floor of Boeing Plant 2 hummed like a living organism, riveters hammering in rhythm, cranes groaning overhead, the smell of solvents, oil, and hot metal drifting through the air. It was March 3rd, 1943, a wet Seattle morning, the kind where the windows fog with condensation and the rain thunders against the roof like artillery. And moving quietly through that storm of noise was Harold Jenkins, a 54-year-old janitor who'd been sweeping industrial floors longer than most of the engineers had been alive. He didn't look like someone who would change the course of the war. A thin man with stiff shoulders, scuffed boots, a faded cap he never removed. The kind of man people nodded to without really seeing. But Harold saw everything. He pushed his mop bucket past Station 14, where teams were prepping the wing roots of a new B-17F for sealing. A young mechanic cursed under his breath. Paint was already blistering along the lower root, peeling up like dead skin. "Humidity's killing it again," someone grumbled. "Primer's too thin," said another. "Engineering says it's fine," a third shot back, "so keep brushing it on." Harold paused, just for a second. He'd seen that same peeling pattern for weeks, thin primer bubbling whenever the wing flexed on the jigs. A tiny detail, the kind most people ignore. But not Harold. He stepped closer, running a calloused thumb gently over a curled edge of paint. Beneath it, the aluminum felt almost slick, too slick. "Mind if I ask?" Harold said, low and polite. "You fellas ever mix the zinc chromate with the shop's older binder, the thicker one?" The mechanics looked at him like he'd suggested painting the aircraft with peanut butter. "That old stuff? Engineering said ditch it months ago," one replied. Harold shrugged. "Used to use it on the big press frames back in '29. Stuck like sin. Never peeled under tension." The crew chief raised an eyebrow. "You a chemist now, Harold?" "No, sir. Just cleaned up after them for 20 years. A small laugh, a shake of the head. The men went back to work. But Harold didn't move. because beneath that peeling primer, he saw something they didn't. A faint, hairline ripple in the aluminum, so small you had to squint to see it, and only when the wing root flexed. He stared at it, mop handle resting against his shoulder, the bustle of the factory dulling into a distant echo. Something wasn't right. And if he was correct, that tiny flaw, multiplied across hundreds of bombers, might someday grow into something catastrophic. But would anyone listen to a janitor? Harold took a breath. Then, with quiet stubbornness, he decided they were going to hear him out anyway.
Harold Jenkins stood outside the small glass-walled office of Engineer Supervisor Charles R. Whitcomb, clutching his cap in both hands. Inside, Whitcomb pored over blueprints, a slide rule tapping impatiently against the table. Harold knocked once. Whitcomb barely glanced up. If it's about spills, talk to maintenance. It's not spills, sir. It's the wing roots. That got Whitcomb's attention. Barely. Harold stepped in, boots weaving a faint trail of rainwater across the polished concrete. Sir, the primer they're using, it's peeling too easy. When the root flexes, the paint don't hold. I'm thinking the old binder mix might... Whitcomb put the slide rule down, slowly, deliberately. Mr. Jenkins, he said, folding his hands, we have spent months validating that formula. Teams of chemists, metallurgists, structural experts. Yes, sir, but it's still peeling. A long silence. Whitcomb sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. You've been sweeping this floor a long time. You do good work. But aircraft engineering, especially at this scale, isn't the place for improvisations. Harold nodded. He expected the dismissal. But he also didn't move. Sir, I've seen that same peeling before, back when they built the pressure housings in '29. Primer slipped, metal cracked under cyclic stress 6 months later. Same pattern, same shimmer to the aluminum. So, I'm telling you, it's a warning. Whitcomb stared at him. The rain hammered against the office window. Finally, Whitcomb said, I'll have an inspector look at it. But Harold could hear the meaning beneath the words. A courtesy check, a gesture, nothing more. By the time he stepped back out onto the factory floor, the engines, riveters, and grinders swallowed him up like he'd never been there at all. Yet, as Harold walked away, something gnawed at Whitcomb's thoughts. A janitor shouldn't know how a wing root flexes under high-altitude stress, or what cyclic fatigue looks like, or how primer chemistry affects metal microfractures. But Harold did. And later that afternoon, when an inspector filed a report saying the primer appeared serviceable, Whitcomb signed off on it. But his hand hovered for just a moment before he set the pen down. Because deep down, a small, unwelcome thought had taken root. What if Harold was right?
2 weeks later, the factory was running at full roar. Another rain-soaked morning. Another line of B-17s moving slowly across the assembly floor like steel giants being woken from sleep. Harold was sweeping beneath Wing Station 12 when a sharp, metallic crack sliced through the factory noise. Not loud, not dramatic, just the wrong kind of sound. Every mechanic within 10 feet froze. A B-17 wing, still unskinned on the underside, had flexed as a hoist shifted weight, and right there, along the same peeling primer line Harold had warned about, a thin strip of aluminum had buckled inward. Not a break, not a failure, but a sign. A sign screaming the same thing Harold had been whispering for weeks. The crew chief called it out. Engineers were summoned. Whitcomb himself jogged over, heart already pounding.
Inspectors traced the line with gloved fingers, their expressions tightening with every inch. Whitcomb knelt beside the wing, running his thumb across the peeled primer. It lifted like sunburnt skin. Then he felt the ripple beneath, the faint, wavering contour Harold had mentioned, the one no one wanted to believe. Whitcomb swallowed hard. "Who prepped this wing?" he demanded. "We did, sir. Same process as always. The primer mix? Same as stock, as cleared." Whitcomb's jaw tightened. He finally said the words aloud. "Get Jenkins here." A murmur rolled through the mechanics. The janitor? Harold approached slowly, wiping his hands on a rag as if embarrassed by the attention. Whitcomb pointed at the damage. "You saw this coming?" "No, sir. I just saw the start of it." Whitcomb exhaled through his teeth. "What was your suggestion? The old binder? Thicker chromate?" "A 50-50, Harold replied quietly. "We used it on the old press frames to stop micro-fractures. Might hold better to flexing metal." Whitcomb looked up at the circle of engineers. "Nobody leaves this floor until we test that mix." Orders shot across the assembly line. Barrels opened. Binders poured. A new batch of primer formed, thicker, heavier, with the faint, oily sheen Harold remembered from the 20s. They applied it to the damaged wing root, flexed it again and again. The new layer didn't peel, not even a bubble. An engineer whispered, stunned, "It's bonding deeper, almost biting into the aluminum." Whitcomb nodded. "We may have missed something critical." But Harold didn't bask in the moment. Instead, he stared at the wing with a hollow, uneasy expression. Because if a single test wing had cracked like that, how many bombers were already in the air with the old primer? How many crews were flying right now, never knowing their wings were one turn, one flak burst, one evasive dive away from disaster? Whitcomb seemed to read the same fear. He turned to communications. "Get a message to right field and to every depot maintaining B-17Fs. Immediate primer protocol revision. Mark it as urgent." Then he added, under his breath, "God help any crew already flying with the old mix."
Word traveled fast. Within 10 days, depots from Wright Field to the 8th Air Force bases in England received new orders. Strip the old primer. Recoat wing roots using the Jenkins-Whitcomb mixture. Mandatory, immediate. Maintenance crews cursed the workload. Hours of sanding, mixing, brushing. But as they worked, many noticed the same unsettling thing. Under the peeling paint of older bombers, tiny stress ripples had begun forming, the kind invisible to most eyes, but not to Harold's. By late April, the new mix was standard across all B-17 production lines. Aircraft rolled out of Boeing Plant 2 with wing roots sealed so tight they looked poured from a single piece of metal. And thousands of miles away, bomb groups began to feel the difference. Pilots reported wings holding through dives that should have sheared rivets. Crews returned with damage patterns that would have destroyed earlier models. Maintenance chiefs quietly whispered that something was different about the new fortresses, something sturdier, safer. One statistic stood out. Wing root structural failures, previously rising, dropped to almost zero. Hundreds of aircraft, thousands of men, lives preserved by a change small enough to fit in a coffee can of yellow primer. But the man responsible never said a word. Harold Jenkins stayed on as a janitor. He kept sweeping the same floors, pushing the same mop cart, leaving the engineers and officers to argue over stress curves and metallurgical reports.
He never asked for recognition, never hinted at what he'd done, not even when Whitcomb himself tried to thank him one rainy evening. Harold simply shook his head. Just didn't want anyone getting hurt. That's all. Whitcomb realized then, Harold wasn't looking for credit. He was trying to sleep at night. Years later, long after the war ended, veterans gathered at reunions. Men who'd survived flak bursts, fighter attacks, and impossible returns on crippled bombers. Many remembered moments when their wing groaned, then held. They never knew why. Their lives had been touched by a man they'd never meet. A janitor, with a sharp eye, a quiet voice, and a suggestion no one wanted to hear, until it was almost too late. Back in Seattle, Harold grew old without fanfare, no medals, no ceremonies, no mention in engineering records. His name was never printed in manuals, never filed in memos, never added to inspection protocols. But history has shadows, and sometimes the people standing in them carry more weight than anyone realizes. If not for Harold Jenkins, the sky over Europe in 1943 would have been filled with a few hundred more falling wings and a few thousand more grieving families. A simple shortcut, a forgotten mixture, a silent act of courage. And it saved more lives than anyone would ever know.